Hello and welcome to the Riverwood Conservancy's very first webinar. My name is Rashid Clark, Marketing Specialist at the Riverwood Conservancy, and I'm seeing right now we have our attendees coming in. We'll give it just a couple of seconds here to let more of our attendees get into the webinar. And we had a great response for this one, so thank you to everyone for signing up, registering ahead of time, and hopefully everyone who registered is going to be able to join us for the webinar today. And so welcome to Ask the Expert Gardeners. As I said, my name is Rashid. I am definitely not one of the expert gardeners. I'm the marketing specialist at the Riverwood Conservancy. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you may be. And from all of us here at TRC, we hope that you're staying safe and healthy. A little bit of housekeeping as we get going here. We had a few questions submitted ahead of time. Those will be posed first when we get to the Q&A segment. If you do have questions during the webinar for our expert gardeners, please type them into the Q&A or the chat panel in Zoom, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Also, as you probably can imagine, as a result of COVID-19, our organization, which is a charitable organization, has taken quite a hit in having a number of our large fundraisers for the next couple of months canceled. So if you have the means to support us and help us continue on with webinars like this and the rest of our essential environmental programming, we'd really appreciate a donation at theriverwoodconservancy.org. You can make that online whenever you have a chance, and thank you in advance if you do. And so on to our expert gardeners. First of all, Douglas Markoff completed his graduate studies in botany at Clemson University in South Carolina, as well as at the University of Toronto. His professional career has included positions as greenhouse manager, nursery manager, college instructor, and of course his current position as the executive director of the Riverwood Conservancy. And Gail Krantzberg, who is right now behind the camera, is a professor in the engineering and public policy program at McMaster University. She completed her PhD at U of T as a freshwater scientist and has authored over 200 publications, authored and edited 9 books. And when not at work, she enjoys her husband, Douglas, her camera, and her garden. And we're going to see that garden as well as the greenhouse today. So I will throw things over to Douglas and Gail for a little garden and greenhouse tour, and then we will be getting over to the questions.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our garden. It is April 23rd, 2020, and we're in the garden of Douglas and Gail. We're in the middle of Mississauga, and this is an April 23rd, unlike any other April 23rd. It is cool out. You can tell by my gloves, my hat. I've got about 4 layers of clothing on. But we're going to walk around the garden. We'll see what's happening, give you a little tips and tricks about pruning at this time of the year, and then we'll end up inside the greenhouse and warm up. So, our spring garden. No garden is complete, first of all, without spring bulbs. Our garden first came into flower about 3 weeks ago, starting with winter snowdrops. That was followed by winter aconites, and then that was followed in turn by crocus. The crocus gave way to Chionodoxa, these lovely blue flowers, blue and white flowers, which naturalize quite nicely throughout the garden. And in front of them are mini daffodils called tete-a-tete. Now, there are bulbs that flower throughout the season here. We have them going into the end of June, and then we even have some fall crocus flowering in the fall. Now, in addition to bulbs, at this time of the year, no garden is complete without hellebores. So one of the new additions to our garden will be this hellebore. This is ice and roses, and it's got these lovely flowers at the top, which actually get quite thick once they're in the ground for a year or so. The plant will get to around 2.5 feet, and it's a wonderful addition to the garden, especially the spring garden. So we're going to continue our walk right now, and we noticed today, for the first time in flower, is our, what we call our fuzzy anemone, Anemone pulsatilla, although I think the plant namers have renamed it, but it's a lovely spring ephemeral. Other plants in the garden right now that are coming into bloom are daffodils. That will soon be followed by camassias and tulips. And there's always something flowering in our garden. This is a species of tulip, a bicolored tulip, very early spring. Now, not only do we have bulbs flowering at this time of the year, but we also have the beginning of flowering shrubs. This is Korean lilac, and of all the lilacs that we have, this is perhaps one of the most fragrant. It's a lovely plant and a wonderful addition to any garden. We're going to move across the driveway right now and show you our cactus patch. So these are native Opuntias. Yes, Canada has native cactus. The cactus go flat during the winter. They're covered by a ton of snow. And then as the days get warm and the sun comes out, the pads will lift up, go vertical, and they flower. They have the most outrageous flower, a yellow flower with an orange throat. Along the way, there are other bulbs and plants, perennials that are beginning to flower. There's also some very unusual evergreens. This is a dwarf weeping spruce. As well, one of the oldest evergreens on the property is this hinoki cypress. Very unusual, pleated architecture to the leaves, loves full sun, and it's surrounded by other perennials. Again, we have more daffodils coming into flower, some species tulips, and we choose the species tulips because they seem to be disregarded by squirrels. One perennial that's coming quite nicely in the garden is this tree peony. You can see that almost every stem has a flower bud on it, and it will produce flowers, a dark purple flower about that diameter. A fabulous addition to any garden, and they come in a diversity of colors. So we're now going to go into the side garden. Again, full of perennials that are just coming into bloom. In fact, a lot of the perennials that you'll see are great for pollinators. Here's a very unusual perennial. This is horseradish. The horseradish has the most outrageous leaves, and it has to be some of the longest leaves in the garden, probably extending close to 3 feet long. And then, of course, you can harvest the horseradish if you'd like to make horseradish. We're going into our side garden right now. This is an example of a white pine that I've been training for the last 15 years to form an arch, an entranceway arch into the garden. It's also a espalier along this fence line. A very unusual horticultural approach. In fact, I've never seen one done this way. Okay, we're going to swap the camera for a moment as Gail, who is the farmer in the family, describes the raspberry patch that we have and how to prune.
So this poor broken branch gave me raspberries last year. So the best thing to do is take out the old wood. So you prune that down to the ground. Now these canes are the second year's growth, and that's where we're going to get raspberries. And you want to prune them quite low, because you want the buds to face outwards. You want them quite low because they get very, very bushy. And if they're too tall, all the raspberries roll down and hit the ground and feed the rodents.
Thank you, Gail.
Oh, shh. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no.
Okay, and it looks as though we have lost the connection, unfortunately, with Gail and Douglas. So now you have me tap dancing for a little bit until we get them back. We do see Douglas and Gail trying to connect again. We'll try to get them back up on the video soon. And we see Gail again. Hello, Gail. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And here's Douglas.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Back to our regularly scheduled program.
Did we see the white pine?
We saw the camera fall, so maybe from wherever the camera dropped at that point, you can take it from there.
Okay. So we're going to continue on in the garden. Here's a very unusual plant. This is a dwarf ginkgo, a must-have for any garden. a very unusual plant. Gets about 3 feet tall compared to its mother, which gets about 75 feet tall. So as we go along the spring garden, again, bearing in mind that it's a very unusual fall, the plants that are beginning to come into flower, here's an example of an allium. This is Allium giganteum. The flower bud gets about 3.5 feet tall, and it's got the most lovely, dark, round bloom on it, which you could actually harvest as a dried flower afterwards. So we're approaching the Gail's vegetable garden. But before we get to the garden, just very briefly, all the plants that you see in our garden, in fact, plants in any garden, they need a handful of conditions. They need good light, and that light will depend on the plant. It could be full sun, it could be dappled light. They need nutrients, they need water, and they need good soil. So the foundation of any good garden is the soil. We compost vigorously. We produce about 1 cubic yard of compost every year. And to produce that 1 compost of garden gold takes somewhere between 4 and 5 cubic yards of material. And that material could be kitchen waste, with the exception of animal bones, and all the garden waste that we produce. So I mentioned a bit about pruning. So this is an example of, well, this is our prop for today. Now, last week we harvested, this is a pussy willow. So last week we harvested all of these pussy willows from this shrub. And after we harvested the pussy willows, I pruned the plants. So this is an example of a plant that you prune at this time of the year. And when you prune, in fact, every gardener should have a good pair of secateurs or hand pruners. When you prune, what you try to do is prune on an angle, which I've done, and you want a bud to be facing outwards. You do not want to cut the stem and have a bud go inwards, because what you're trying to do is introduce as much light into the center of the plant as possible for optimum growth. And again, we could talk more about plant pruning, what gets pruned at this time of the year and what does not get pruned at this time of the year. Okay, we're moving on to another aspect of the garden. Here we have at the base of the pussy willow, we have some very heavy daylilies. And we want to move the daylilies out of the way. Well, how do you do that? So there's a technique called transplanting, or lift and split. So I've started this already with my handy spade, a nice flathead spade with a good blade on it. And I dug it out. Now we're going to lift it up. Lift it up, and you can see the clump of lilies that we have. So these lilies are not going to flower for you because it's way too thick and they like some room. So all you need to do with daylilies, they're very forgiving, is you take them and you kind of tease it out. You'll end up with a plant with a nice root system on that, and that you could transplant anywhere around the garden. You can see the roots that it has. And again, they're very, very tough plants. So all you need to do is split it off, stick it in the ground, trade it, and expand your garden that way. Okay, so we're going to turn this over to Gail. We're in front of Gail's vegetable garden. She's really the farmer in the family. And take it away, Gail.
Welcome to my vegetable garden. Well, obviously there's nothing here yet. But this is a time of the year where you can do some interesting things. Here's lettuce seeds. What I do in the summer is I let the lettuce bolt a little bit and it dries up, and then I collect the seeds, and they're all sprinkled through here with a tiny little bit of soil on top of them. They'll germinate within a few weeks, and you should plant these once the weather gets warmer, about every 2 weeks, so you have lettuce all summer long. What you can do, this is cut and come again lettuce, so you can let them get nice and big and tall, or you can instead just cut the lettuce every week and have nice fresh baby greens. Something else that you want to do at this time of year and not do at this time of year These are peas, snap peas, sugar snap peas. You see how plump they are? I soaked them overnight, and then I'm going to put them in the ground, surrounded by some stakes, and they'll climb it up. You can even wrap the stakes in chicken wire so they have the tendrils have somewhere to go. Absolutely delicious. This is beans. These are scarlet runner beans. Don't plant your beans yet. These are warm weather crops. So when the tomatoes go in and the peppers go in and everything that needs the ground nice and warm, that's when you put your beans in. Now, if we go over here, I'm going to show you a little trick about planting your onions. So here I have onion sets. They're Spanish onions. And if I let them go all summer long in nice compost-rich soil, you get nice big plump onions. But what you really want to do, it's dead simple. Pointy end up, just put it just under the ground, pat it down, and put the next one right beside it. I think I'll just use my fingers, every few inches. And then what's going to happen, as these grow up, you want to start thinning them out. So these make beautiful salad greens, salad onions, like the nice spring salad onions, and then you let the ones beside it get nice and big and fat and mature, and you'll have delicious onions in the fall.
Gail, I notice there's a lot of this white material in the garden. What is that?
These are eggshells.
Why do you put eggshells in?
Eggshells, tomatoes love eggshells. The eggshells will break down very slowly and release calcium into the soil, and that's great for tomatoes. It avoids that blossom end rot, in the bottom of the tomato that goes black. It needs calcium. That's what that calcium is for. So save your eggshells, put them all throughout your garden. Put a handful of eggshells in when you plant your tomatoes. They'll love it. It decomposes slowly, so it's a slow release of calcium all summer long.
Can you use this technique if you were growing tomatoes on your balcony?
Oh, absolutely. You can use this technique anywhere. Just if you're growing tomatoes on your balcony, make sure you have a large enough pot and that you water it very, very well, and that you're going to stake it also because they get quite tall and they need support. The only other thing I want to show you here are these. This is garlic. This garlic went in October, and it's coming up beautifully. You see how nicely spaced out they are? I'll have beautiful big heads of garlic in about July and August. As the foliage gets brown, you lift them up, dry them on the air, dry them in the sunshine, and you'll have the most juicy, pungent garlic you can imagine.
Thank you. So we're going to walk over to the side of our garden for a moment to show you a very radical pruning. This is not the sort of pruning that a beginning gardener should do, but do bear in mind that there are some shrubs that get awfully large, and sometimes you have to get radical with them. It's called tough love. So this is a viburnum, a double file viburnum that was about 8 feet tall by 10 feet broad as of last fall. And then I said, well, this is taking over the garden. So what are we going to do? So we pruned it back severely. Now I will not get flowers this year, but what I will get is new growth, and then I'll be able to control it starting fresh. Okay, we're going to walk towards the greenhouse right now. A few more perennials along the way, just beginning. In fact, one of my favorite perennials, Gail's pointing the camera at a Aquilegia, a columbine rather. This is one of my favorite perennials. This is Mucdenia rossii. And up until early last week, it was doing quite well. And then an early frost got a lot of the early flowers, and you can see the results of that. But new flowers are coming, and when the flowers fade away, you've got some really interestingly architectural leaves, which last all summer, and then come the fall, they turn a bronzy red. So there's always something that's wonderful about the plant all year. So we're about to go into the greenhouse, but I thought I would show you one of the most fragrant viburnums. This is Viburnum burkhardi, and it's going to flower as soon as the heat and the sun reach it, and it'll be full of blossoms. And during dawn and dusk, the perfume just wafts through the garden. It's lovely. Now, what we noticed earlier is that something else has come into flower, but you wouldn't notice it until you got down. And so, what is this, Gail?
Ginger.
This is ginger, and it forms a great ground cover. And you can see that at the base, you've got to lift the leaves a little bit, but at the base of the leaves is this wonderful maroon colored flower, which is darling in the garden. And again, it's a great ground cover. So if you're looking to cover the soil, prevent soil erosion, it's a native plant. And like many plants in our garden, it actually attracts pollinators.
That's the first time I've seen it this season. That's great.
So come on into our greenhouse. So welcome to our little greenhouse. And some for ourselves. So I'm going to take the phone again, and Gail's going to take us through some of the plants that we're growing.
These are heirloom tomatoes that were started from seed about a month ago. They're getting quite tall and leggy. There's many different varieties here, orange ones, purple ones, yellow ones, pink ones, black ones. But what they're going to need is to harden off. They need to get tough. So as soon as it's not 5 degrees outside, maybe when it's 10 degrees outside, I'll put them outside for a few hours in the shade, and then gradually over time move them into a little bit of sunshine. If you put them straight out into the sunshine right away, they will burn, just like you getting a bad sunburn. So harden off your tomatoes. They're incredible. And what you can start, maybe a little late for you to start your own tomatoes now, but you can certainly start your own herbs. This is purple basil, though every so often you get a green variety, and it's too much in here. So what I have to start doing is thinning it out, taking out the straggly ones, pulling them out gently, leaving just a few in the cell, and don't throw that out. Throw it in your salad. So we have over here bay laurel. Everybody knows about bay leaves and tomato sauce and bay leaves in soups. This will grow to be a giant bush over time, but just put it outside. It loves the sunshine. Feed it well, take it nicely watered. Delicious, nutritious, and you can grow it on anywhere. You can grow it on your porch if you wanted to.
One of the plants that we've been propagating for Riverwood, for the gardens at Riverwood, are these Montauk daisies. So I actually got stems from one of our garden volunteers last year, propagated it, and they've rooted quite nicely. So as soon as we can access Riverwood, we'll be planting these out. These Montauk daisies are really quite lovely, and it's probably one of the last perennials to flower in the garden, a white daisy-like flower. So I think that's the end of our garden tour. Again, there's so much more to see. In fact, every day that you come and you walk outside, there's always something new to see, whether it's your own gardens, the gardens around your condo, or gardens at Riverwood. So at this point, we're going to open this up for questions and answers. And Rashid, as he mentioned earlier, is going to moderate this, and we'll try to answer your garden questions.
Hey, thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Gail. Excellent tour, and a lot of questions coming in live on Zoom. And also, we had some people submit questions ahead of the webinar after they registered, so we're going to get to those ones first. So first question, I'm using old recycling blue boxes as containers in which to grow vegetables. Any tips for getting the best yield from small spaces?
Yes, I'll let Gail answer this after I just put in a few words. We've used containers for tomatoes and for potatoes, and they work quite well. The beauty of the blue boxes, for example, is that they have drainage holes. I would advise you, however, to increase the size of the drainage holes to ensure good drainage through the blue bin.
The only thing that I would add to that, and that's really important, is that you can grow just about anything in containers. So if you just have a balcony, you don't have a garden or a lawn, you can grow herbs, you can grow radishes, you can grow carrots, you can grow lettuce, you can grow whatever you want. But make sure that you take care of the watering very carefully, because if it's just in a container, in a enclosed space, it could dry up quickly, but you can grow anything in containers. Thank you.
All right. Next question. My back lawn is a mix of grass, white clover, and creeping Charlie, with the creeping Charlie gradually taking over. The soil is heavy clay and gets quite a bit of walking on as I tend the gardens. I tend to give it minimal lawn care except for mowing. Can you suggest any ground cover, something good for pollinators and ideally native, that would be better for the environment and for appearances than this hodgepodge? Or should I encourage more clover?
Yeah, welcome to our world. We've got Creeping Charlie all around the garden. We've tried to pull it out, but invariably you miss a couple, and they seed like mad, and it just continues to creep around the garden. Again, sort of pretty to look at, but it is invasive. So I would not recommend leaving your lawn to just Creeping Charlie. White clover is an alternative. White clover is really good for pollinators. You'll see a lot of flying bees and other insects around the white clover. White clover, there's a pro and con with white clover. Yes, it does attract pollinators. However, it's not native. And the thing about white clover is that it is a perennial that will require reseeding every couple of years. White clover is also not the sort of plant that you'd be able to step on regularly. It won't take heavy traffic. So the other plant that we've experimented with here is violets. We've used violets in lieu of grass and sun. White clover or red clover, although Creeping Charlie really is a tough plant, but it's not, again, it's not native.
Okay, back to planting and safely planting considering the conditions and the weather that we've had recently. I have plants growing from seeds that are about 9 inches tall after replanting them deeper. I'd like to plant them outdoors when the weather gets warmer, but it snowed recently, I think as early as just a couple of days ago. So when can I put them out safely in, I guess, the greater Toronto area?
Okay, well, we'll assume for the moment that they're vegetables, in which case I'll turn that over to Gail.
So although everybody plants like on the May 31st weekend, 24th weekend, I don't. The best time to get these out is when the soil is warm. So what I would do with your plants as they're getting leggy is, as I said before, start hardening them off maybe in early May, just leave them out for a few hours at a time, but wait until June before you get them into the soil, and then plant them quite deeply.
All right.
Same thing with any other plants. If you're growing small tropical plants or perennials by cutting, same thing. Don't put them out too early. Again, we've had a number of spring frosts, which would decimate these tender vegetables, herbs, or perennials.
Next.
Okay, next question. I have a pink endless summer hydrangea, which I transplanted about 5 years ago. It was always a beautiful plant full of blooms all summer, even after moving it flowered beautifully. 2 summers ago, I pruned it heavily and it did not bloom that summer, and last summer had only 1 flower on it. Can you provide any advice on how to get it to bloom again?
Yeah, the endless summer hydrangea is it's a really pretty plant. In fact, it went on market maybe 10 years ago. It was actually introduced by Durr. The unique thing about that hydrangea is that it flowers twice. It flowers early in the spring using wood from the previous year, and then it flowers again on new wood in the summer. Now, the plant really hasn't lived up to its name. It was marketed very heavily, but we have found that it's extremely tender to spring frosts. So it's quite possible that the buds that it had formed the previous year that it was going to flower on were damaged by the frost, and so you're not going to get flowers. Same thing with the summer. If the temperatures, if the buds that were there in order to flower during the summer do have temperatures that dip below a certain minimum, it's going to impact your flower set as well. So if you didn't have any issues with temperatures and you're still having difficulty with flowering or not flowering, what you could do is think about your soil. As I said earlier, it's really the soil that will determine how good your plants go. So if we assume for the moment that your hydrangea is getting sufficient light, what I would suggest you do is that you fertilize it with a high phosphorus fertilizer. Remember, hydrangeas still require an acid fertilizer in order to produce the pink or blue blooms. But if you're having difficulty getting them into bud, I would recommend a high phosphorus fertilizer, which is the second number. Make sure that that second number in the sequence of 3 is twice as much as the first number.
Great.
All right. Next question. Bit of a description here before we get into the question. I live at the top of a ravine, and we have raccoons who enter our courtyard every night and tear up the grass. The courtyard is above an underground parking garage, which has a membrane on the roof and only about a 6-inch depth of dirt for the grass to grow in. I'm not sure what the raccoons are digging for. Any advice on getting rid of these kind of critters? We tried the coyote urine application, sounds like fun, last season, and we'll try that again this year.
Yeah, we've had challenges with raccoons as well, and I'll let Gail speak to how we thwarted them.
So there's a few things you can use. One of which that is effective is, unfortunately, blood meal. It's very pungent, and but they can't stand the smell. The other thing that you can do, if you happen to have a cat that is an indoor cat, is put the cat litter outside because they don't like ammonia. So it's using smells to deter them. Another thing that you can do if it's just soil is sprinkle it with hot pepper, like cayenne pepper, pepper spray. But be careful, don't do that if you've got a lot of grass, because it'll burn the grass. So deterrents are best really smelly stuff. I'm not sure that garlic works for them so much, but certainly blood meal and ammonia could do the trick. Thanks.
And of course, part of the question you have to ask yourself is what are the raccoons digging for? Are there grubs in the lawn? Typically, they're looking for some food, which could be roots or it could be grubs or some other insect in the ground. So while you may not find it, they can smell it. So I would suggest that you get a turf expert out there and see what's happening. Why are the raccoons digging in your lawn?
Okay. Next question, pruning question, specifically about lavender. My plant is 2 years old, so still quite compact. How much of last year's growth should be pruned in the spring? There are some tiny new leaves showing near the base and possibly some further up on the old stems.
So I wouldn't prune it just yet. Give it a little bit longer to see more of the growth pushing out. But you can easily take that back by 25%, even as much as about 40% down. But you want to cut where you already see new foliage pushing out. So it's a good idea to give it a little bit longer to see that new foliage pushing out. And you can cut it back quite severely. It's quite hardy that way. Thanks.
I'd like to add a little bit to Gail's response, though not necessarily related to lavender. I think a lot of us do have a habit of wanting to get out early and prune things back. As with lavender, just a little bit of caution. Wait until you see some new growth, and that will give you a clue as to where to prune. That could be with Rose of Sharon's, clematis vines, and a whole variety of plants. So wait until you see some growth. This is also the case, especially with roses.
And for clematis, you're going to see a lot of growth right now. Unfortunately, it's very high. So with clematis, because they're already pushing out, many of them, you can cut them back to about 18 inches to the ground. There you go.
Cool. Next question, more of the balcony garden variety. So someone who has a balcony garden and tried to grow morning glory last year, but grew but never bloomed. So any advice on getting them to actually bloom this time around?
Yeah, I love the morning glories, particularly the horticultural varieties, as opposed to the invasive vines that you find rampant throughout much of Ontario. So the flowering plants, which typically are a lovely bluey purple or a reddish purple, first they need good sun, reasonable water, if they're still not coming into flower, it is an indication that there's something off with your soil. They do not like rich soil. They like nutrient-poor soil, which is why they're so successful on roadsides and disturbed areas. So I would, before you seed them this year, I would add some sand or so to your container, unless you want to replace all the soil in your container, just to break up the nutrients. And as I mentioned earlier, when it came to the hydrangea, ensure that nitrogen is low. It seems like you're getting good growth, which suggests that there's plenty of nitrogen in the soil and perhaps too much nitrogen in the soil, but try to increase that second number, the phosphorus, which will lead to flower production.
All right, next question, quick one. How do you get rid of moss in flower gardens?
Moss in flower gardens. Well, moss in flower gardens is an indication that it's moist and organic, and that the air circulation is less than optimal. We actually try to grow moss, believe it or not, to layer on top of our bonsais. In fact, I've tried to grow a moss garden at Riverwood once, actually using milk and yogurt to fertilize them, but we couldn't maintain it, and so it didn't work out so well. Anyway, if you want to get rid of moss in your gardens, again, it's got to be less moisture, and just if you can introduce a little bit more light into it, that will take care of the mosses. And be careful, like, is it a moss or is it a liverwort? Like, they can be a little bit confusing, but either way, less moisture, less organic matter, and more sun will control mosses and liverworts.
Okay, before we get to the next question from the audience, Douglas, Gail, how are you guys holding up? You okay for more questions? Because we do have quite a few.
Sure, we can use a few more.
Okay, so we'll keep them going here. These are from today's webinar attendees. I'd like to grow some perennials in containers that can last over winter outside. What plant would you recommend, and is there anything extra I should do to protect them over the winter?
Yeah, whether you're trying to grow perennials out on a balcony or shrubs or evergreens, the rule of thumb is to ensure that whatever you do grow, that the plant freezes and remains frozen during the winter. That's one of the reasons why plants will not survive the winter, because the sun is on there, the plants are going through alternate freezing and thawing, and that will devastate the plants. So what I have done before is I've used containers. I've actually insulated the inside of the container with some styrofoam. So when the winter sets in, the plants do in fact remain frozen. I would also do two other things. Before winter sets in, I would make sure that the plant is well watered, so the roots have taken up as much water as possible to allow them to survive the winter. I would move the container into an area of the balcony where it's shady, so it's not exposed to sun, so that prevents the freezing and thawing. And again, insulate your container. But even with all of that, it's a very dicey kind of gardening to try to get perennials and evergreens surviving on a balcony in a container.
Okay, question for the vegetable gardener. Two-part question, I guess. Is straw good for vegetable gardens? And I guess kind of related to the question about raccoons, how do I deter squirrels from the garden, especially if you're trying to grow some vegetables?
So yeah, straw is a very good mulch. Absolutely, it's a good mulch. Make sure that it's a good quality, so you don't get a lot of weeds growing out of it. But straw is a great mulch. So answer yes. In terms of rodents, there's a few things you can do. Rodents don't like garlic. What we do with the giant alliums that we showed you earlier is after a few years they don't actually flower. I dig those up, chop them up, and then put them in my vegetable garden where the rodents like to eat, like the lettuce and the beans and so on, and they stay completely away. So if you don't have that, you can buy very cheap garlic and just chop it up and leave it all around the vegetables that the squirrels and the rodents like. The other thing that you can do, which is a little bit more sophisticated, is to get an electric fence. It's just a wire system with some, rechargeable batteries. and you just wire around the vegetable garden where the squirrels have access. The wire should be pretty close to the ground, but not touching, otherwise it'll ground. But you could use an electric fence. Just make sure you turn it off when you go in the garden, turn it back on when you leave the garden. And that's extremely effective, although it's a bit more intensive than just trying to use garlic. There are other methods that have been said to work that I've never found to work, like marigolds, but they're better for insect deterrence, like hot herbs and things, but they're really not that effective. So I would recommend the garlic, and the straw mulch is absolutely a great idea.
Back to something I think, Douglas, you had spotted in the tour, the name of your favorite perennial with the ornamental leaves that turn color in the fall. What was the name?
Yes. Mukdenia, Mukdenia, Rossii. Again, a fabulous perennial. It spreads slowly but surely. Great flowers which emerge before the leaves. The leaves are ornamental or architectural, and then the leaves in the fall will turn this wonderful bronzy red.
All right.
Rossii.
Back to Gail. Looking to growing Brussels sprouts, when would be the best time to plant them from seeds? And where would you recommend garden seeds with the current situation and most places being closed? A good question, and I guess that kind of applies not just for seeds, but garden supplies in general right now. With a lot of places closed, where can people turn?
So if you want to grow Brussels sprouts from seeds, start them 2 weeks ago. So anytime now, get them going right away.
Go now. No.
Get them going. You probably want to, so some stores, like grocery stores, will have a seed section. I would look there. Some garden centers are going to open up. You may be able to find the Brussels sprouts already as seedlings. My understanding is that given the COVID-19 issue, that although those garden centers will be open, they'll do the same thing as the grocery stores are doing, which is just to limit the number of people that can come in. So I think that will be available. The same thing with going to a garden center right now. You could try and buy the seeds online. There's lots of online catalogs all over Canada that should get to you pretty quickly. But you are running out of time if you want to start brassicas from seed right now, like broccoli or Brussels sprouts or any of the brassicas. So the sooner the better.
Question about where you're standing right now in the greenhouse. Is it temperature controlled, or are the windows enough to keep the greenhouse warm? Or is the house heater connected to the greenhouse, or have another heating supply for the winter?
Yeah, good question. We have a independent gas-fired furnace in the greenhouse. Conduit which goes up the wall and runs the length of the ceiling. So this is our primary heat source. Secondary heat source, we have baseboard heating, which I haven't turned on for 10 years, although I do test it every year. The beauty of the heating system is that it's the least expensive, and perhaps the key is a ceiling fan. So you can have the best heating. Interesting is that it's automatic. So all I need to do is set a thermostat, which I do very frugally. I keep it at 67 degrees during the evening, and during the day, it pretty well turns off and heats up by the sun on the polycarbonate, which goes into the greenhouse. And what's interesting is that the floor as well, which is stone or what's also interesting about the greenhouse, just talk about the automatic nature of it, is that the ventilators will open and close automatically. And it's just a wax-filled piston. So when the gas expands, it opens up the piston, which is attached to the ventilators. As the temperature cools, the wax contracts and the ventilators close. So it's a very elegant and simple system.
Okay, and now aware of the fact that you've already answered many questions, we'll try to get to a few more before we wrap up for this webinar today. But obviously we've had a great response today. and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. And if not today, we'll try to hold another webinar like this again in the future. So earlier, as you guys were doing the tour, you showed the compost area. So a question, curious about your compost. When do you harvest your compost? And do you have any tips for putting it down? Are there any priority areas in your garden, even if you don't grow veggies?
Yeah, we use compost throughout the garden. We do, as you mentioned, we do add a lot to the vegetable garden, but I use it on the perennials as well. The compost bin is really quite easy to work. We layer it. We add soil after we have a bunch of greens. We harvest the compost bin in the spring. So in another few weeks, I'll be out there with a shovel and a pitchfork, and gathering the garden gold, putting it into wheelbarrows, and then spreading it around the garden. It's really easy to operate. All you need is a bit of time, and we add everything. In fact, we hardly even put out our garbage bin anymore. We compost so much.
Okay. And, you know, we'll get to one last question now. And as we said, we had a great response. So sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions today. But last one for now. Can I use periwinkle as a ground cover instead of my grass lawn, which has been invaded by Creeping Charlie?
Well, vinca or periwinkle is just as invasive as Creeping Charlie. It's a very successful plant. It escapes cultivation quite easily. It's pretty with the flowers, and the nurseries still sell it. However, it is non-native, it's quite invasive, and it will dominate your garden. Again, it works very well. It's not a steppable kind of plant by any means. And again, it doesn't attract any pollinator. It doesn't provide any net ecological gain, but it is still sold, but I would not recommend it as a plant to put into your garden.
Okay. Douglas, Gail, thank you so much for sharing your time and your house, essentially, with all of us here. Thank you for the tour of the garden, the tour of the greenhouse, and for answering all the questions that were coming in today from people who joined the webinar. And for everyone who joined the webinar today, thank you so much for sharing some of your time with us. Again, apologies that we couldn't get to all of the questions because there were many. We'll do our best to have another one of these webinars again in the future. And of course, if you have gardening questions or just anything related to the environment, you can always send us a message on social media through Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Our handle is @YourRiverwood. Love to hear from you and get those conversations going. And thanks again for your participation here today. Before we wrap up, just a reminder that as a result of COVID-19, of course, all of us are staying indoors, and for folks like us at the Riverwood Conservancy, we're dealing with quite a few less funds to work with as a result of the cancellation of some of our major fundraising events. So if you have the means and you can help us support more of these online learning platforms as we go forward, you can make a donation at theriverwoodconservancy.org. And stay tuned to our website as well for more information about upcoming webinars. So Douglas, Gail, thank you again for sharing all of the wonderful greenery with us. And for everyone watching, thank you for your time today, and please stay safe. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.